Okay, got that. Now I'm going to set to record it. Well, happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to the first in a four-part series of Contracts 101 with your host, Mark Miller, our wonderful compliance director, and me, Broker Bob. Want to welcome everybody for being on time. And let's get going. A few housekeeping items. I would love it, as Peggy asked earlier, if you want to keep your camera on so I can see your face. This is a very participatory style class. Even though we're on Zoom, we're not in front of each other. Yet when we go through the stuff, materials we'll talk about today, I want you to be able to ask a question. I want you to say, hey, what does that mean? Or I don't understand that. And remember, no question is stupid. There's only a stupid answer, and that's me being a smart ass back. But just go ahead and just ask the question. It's okay, because you know what? These are all new forms, even for me and Mark. And I'm most of the time calling Mark, I'm like, what is this about? And they released a whole bunch of forms at the same time with the buyer broker. So we're going to review all those today. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to drop some files in the chat box. So, and I'm going to put it out in piecemeal. I'm not going to give it to you all at one time. So give me a minute just to find the forms I need to drop in. And Mark, do you have anything to say? Well, I look for that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thanks everybody for being here. There's quite a few, 31 people on right now. That's great. And if you do have a question while we're going, through this, it's interactive. So just, unmute. You don't have to raise your hand. You can just unmute and ask your question. Or if you really want to, not do that, you can drop it in the chat. Robert may not be able to see the chat, but I'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, I have a quick question. Oops.
Sure.
So when you drop, like you just did, something in the chat box, if I click on it, does it download to my computer without getting me out of the meeting?
Yeah, it will download. It actually gives you an option.
A little arrow. Yeah, I just saw it.
It says download completed. And then you can actually click on it again and open it.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You got it. Okay. The first thing I sent you is something simple. So the first thing we're going to talk about is agency. Agency in the state of California. So that's the form DA. Is that correct, Mark? DA, not AD, right?
AD.
AD. And agency is it's what you were really responsible for in regards to the relationship between your buyers and your sellers. You have a duty to them in the relationship, and agency describes that fiduciary duty. And fiduciary means above all others. I'd like you to write that down. Fiduciary, above all others. And I'm going to share my screen so you can see the script that I uploaded. If you want to go ahead and pull it up on your computer, maybe you have multiple screens, do that as well too. But agency is often missed because when it needs to be discussed with the buyer and or seller. If you all remember your training before you got your real estate license and your real estate classes you took, they discussed agency. And agency needs to be discussed, and it's only a disclosure. It's only a disclosure. That means it's informational purposes for your buyer or seller. And so anytime you start entering into a relationship with a buyer and or seller, you need to be prepared to discuss what agency is, because that's your legal responsibility to do. You're legally obligated to disclose agency at the very earliest convenience in the relationship. So when does that mean? What does that mean? So you are out and you're prospecting, maybe you're doing an open house and you meet a prospective buyer. At the open house, you strike it up and they decide they want to meet with you to talk about their home search. They really like you. So you wouldn't do it right there, but the best method to do it would be at your initial meeting. And so hopefully prior to you taking a buyer out and showing them properties, you sat down with them and have done an effective buyer consultation. And I'll cover some of those steps that we're taught in Ignite, but these are the basic steps that you have. It's the minimum baseline when you do a consultation, the steps you should follow to ensure you have a successful outcome. And of course, the successful outcome is to get a buyer to agree to work with you. Even more successful, they agree to sign the buyer broker and all the other documents. But basically, when you want to do it is at the very beginning, and it's a pretty simple script. And this is just kind of an outline. Now, remember, a script is a script word for word, but when you make it your own, that's when it becomes part of you. So practice this prior to getting in front of them. And so this is kind of like how it would go. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. Before we get going, I have some legal obligation as a licensee in the state of California. And the first obligation I have is to disclose to you what agency is in our relationship. Now, it's only a disclosure. It's not an agreement that binds you to me in any way. I just am legally required to disclose agency in the state of California. Agency is a relationship that creates a fiduciary duty owed by me to you, the principal, within the course and scope of the agency and the authority granted by that principal. In other words, the fiduciary means I put you above all others. Agency is created, for example, when a listing agreement is signed, a buyer representation agreement is signed, or a lease is signed, to name a few. There are two types of agencies in the state of California. There's what's called single agency. That's where a home you purchase or sells, where there's an agent with a completely different company other than KW Metro. And in this instance as well, too, KW Signature, even though we're sister offices, that's a complete separate office. So that's single agency, even though I'm the broker over there as well, that's still single agency. And then dual agency is where a home you purchase and or sell is where there is an agent within our office at KW Metro might represent the other side, or a situation where an agent represents both buyer and both seller. Those are very rare, though. We do allow agents in our office to represent both buyer and seller after approval by me. And you can't be a brand new agent because I want to make sure you stay in the business and not get out of it. And by the way, 90% of all cases that are litigated are dual agency relationships in the state of California, where an agent represents both buyer and seller. So they're the most litigated. So it's not something we really want to have agents do in order to think they're going to double commission, but in effect, they lose their license. Okay, back on the script though. Again, this is only disclosure, does not bind you to me in any way. Okay, that's kind of a long-winded way, but I wrote all that out because I wanted you to also understand what fiduciary is. You're probably not going to say that to your prospect. The long and short of it would be, I'm required by the state of California to disclose what agency is. There's two forms, single, dual. You can go into those a little bit. And again, I need to give you this form. You have it printed out, or if you're going to do digital, they'll sign that they can read and sign. So then you give it to them and say, take time to read it. If you have any questions, or if you just want to go ahead and sign it, I'll give you a copy of it, and we can get going on the what your goal is today to talk about your home search. Keep it short and sweet. It doesn't have to be really long, but it's supposed to be done at that time. That's the law, and a lot of agents miss that. Present company excluded. And then today we're going to discuss the buyer broker compensation agreement, the new BRBC, and why you want to get people into a BRBC. But I just kind of outlined the initial buyer consultation should follow these 7 steps at a minimum. You'll learn that in our Ignite classes on how to do an effective consultation. And if you're a brand new agent and as your broker and also leading the coaches, I always recommend you do buyer and listing consultations with your peers, and you practice before you go out in the field. Just my recommendation, because you don't want to practice on the real people. You want to practice with your peers so you can get really good. All right, any questions on that? Okay, no questions. Everybody's being quiet. I'm opening up my chat box so I can kind of see some stuff.
Peggy just asked if you could zoom in on the text a little bit larger, make it a little bit larger. So
What's the matter, Peggy? You got old eyes like me? What is this?
I think
I'm
she's,
old, but it
she's
was
on-
the previous. This one's fine. It was the previous one. The text was
she's
small.
on a mobile phone, I think, too. Or are you on a computer?
I'm on a computer. I'm just old.
She's probably on a jitterbug. Who knows? Jitterbug. You all know what a jitterbug is, don't you?
No,
Nobody knows what a jitterbug?
I know.
I
what
do.
the jitterbug-
Does it have something to do with WAM?
No, a jitterbug is what you get your mother, or if she's older, your grandmother a phone. It only has the big buttons on
Oh,
it.
that jitterbug.
That's a jitterbug. I didn't know that.
Okay, so for some reason this just screwed up on me. Hold on.
I think you just have to
There.
scroll, but there
Okay.
you go, a little bit.
Okay, so what we're going to discuss today is all these forms, the BRBC, which replaces the BRE that was out there, the BRNE and the BRNN. I don't know what those stand for, but I know what the BRE stands for. We're also going to talk about the new form, the Anticipated Broker Compensation Disclosure, ABCD, and then the Seller's Payment to Buyer's Broker, the SPBB, and that's referenced in RPA. And I want you to write this down. It's referenced in RPA, optional paragraph 3G3. This is some confusion for agents if they never gone through a class like this. Do they check that box or not check that box when they submit an offer, not knowing what to do with it? We've been getting offers from cooperating brokers where they've checked it, but they didn't have the proper forms with it. And then the cancellation of buyer's representation. I love this form. The previous form was termination of buyer's agency, but this form, we'll get into that, why I like that better as your broker. And then the notice of broker involved properties. And when we say broker involved, we're going to go over what that means, the NBIP. And then the buyer transactional advisory, the BTA, which is an advisor. And we'll get into what an advisory is. So I didn't put this presentation together. I stole it from the California Association of Realtors legal webinar. Borrowed, yeah, borrowed. Mark and I sat in on this class. Mark, I did have time to go through the whole thing previous to as well. Thanks for the recommendation.
Great.
But we go to the live legal webinars and they give really good handouts. And I'm like, rather than going through the actual form, which I will, let me pull that up, by the way. Actually want to review all the forms that you're going to look at when you get the BRBC signed. Can everybody see that, or need to make it bigger?
You can click on full screen and that would help.
There it is. I'm like, what am I not seeing? Okay, so here's that disclosure regarding agency relationship, the form AD. This explains agency. So when you pull up the BRBC, this will automatically be in there, as well as the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. This is a now new legally required form that we have to give to potential our buyers and sellers. And I'm not going to review these forms in detail. I'm just going to show you what's in there. There's also the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. And basically, this is basically saying to your prospective buyer, hey, I'm going to represent you, but I also might have another buyer that I might represent on some properties we look at. So I need to let you know that in advance. Same thing with sellers. I'm going to list your home in this neighborhood, but I might list a home across the street. And then it goes over dual agency, etc. And then the wire fraud, this is most significant form that you should actually spend a little time on when you are presenting this to your mostly prospective buyers, because the buyers are going to be the ones when they get into escrow are going to wire their funds electronically to escrow. And so I won't go into detail of the form other than you should take some time to read it. And when you're advising the buyers about if they're going to wire funds into escrow, they need to follow these rules. And making sure that they don't follow some strange email that pops up that says, hey, we need your money today. Only deal with the escrow person and make sure they have the actual escrow wiring instructions on a secure, sent via secure email. And it's sent that way, and if they call the escrow company to verify. Let's also go back to one more thing as your broker. Highly, highly, highly recommend, now that you're a real estate agent and you have a business, this wire fraud advisory, wire fraud is on the rise, and it keeps happening. It happens more and more. Most of these people that are committing wire fraud are either Russian, or they're in Russia or China, and they're getting away with it. Once they transfer the funds, we can't get it back. How do you protect yourself? This is what happens. So we as agents love to advertise that we got a buyer in escrow, how exciting that is, or we got the seller's home in escrow. And these people are trolling, these wire fraud people are trolling on the internet looking for this. They know you're a real estate agent. Matter of fact, they're probably already have gotten into your computers. They probably have already hacked in the backside of your computer. And what they do is they'll see, and they'll get in the backside of your computer, and they'll see the emails going back and forth between you and your buyer and or seller. And then when it gets closer to the money needs to be wired, the big money needs to be wired to close escrow, that's where they create this fake email address and then send this fake email to the buyer saying, hey, this is Aida. I'm in a class today, but escrow just called me and says they need your $50,000 wired before 11 so we can close escrow on Friday. And then the buyer thinks, oh, it's coming from Aida because maybe they have Aida's email address and they might have changed one little letter, but it still kind of looked like Aida and they just copied her to a T. That's how they get into it, and they get into it because you're probably not working on secured email. You don't have two-party validation, or heaven forbid you're using an AOL email address or Yahoo. And I'm sorry, I will rake on AOL and Yahoo and MSN. You should not be using that email when you're communicating with your principals about an escrow. You should be using a secure email like your KW email, because that has two-party verification in it and it's secure. Keller Williams spends extra security with so that's my little beef about people that want to use their Hotmail address or their Yahoo. It doesn't look professional, but it's really about security in your transactions. Okay, and then this is the BRBC, which we won't go into right now. This is where it's going to start. Okay.
So you see that, in this form package that Robert just rolled through, that all those forms are in one file, or one template, let me put it that way, when you open it in your forms preparation software zip form. The reason that they're all bundled together is they're all supposed to be presented together. So don't just take out the BRE and not have the client look at and sign all those other documents that are also in there. Some of them are required by law, so they have to be all presented and signed at the same time.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
When you pull up the BRB, obviously all those things come up like you just said, but also when you pull up the RPA, all those things auto-populate as well. Do I need to make my clients sign them again, or can I just get rid of them?
Technically, you should probably have them sign it again. They're bundled together. I mean, in the event that you had not had the buyer sign a BRE or BRB, getting the acronyms messed up, BRBC, before they actually sign the purchase agreement, that's why they're bundled in there as well. And I think it would be good from a dotting I's, crossing T's standpoint to have forms signed concurrent with the date of the purchase agreement signed. So, maybe there is an additional form in the RPA package that isn't in the BRE or BRBC package. So I'd say go ahead and have them sign all of those again.
Okay, thank you.
So if you're not logged into your Zip forms where you're seeing this form, I just dropped into the chat box the actual BRBC. And if you want to use that as a guide, if you have the ability to print it off at home to take notes, highly recommend taking notes with that. If you don't have that ability, then if you're mobile, come back and listen to this presentation. It is recorded on YouTube. Okay.
One other thought on that, Robert, is re-presenting the same forms again, like in the case of that wire fraud advisory, you cannot advise your client enough times.
Yes, especially on that.
Multiple times is not a bad thing, is what I'm trying to say. So
I would remind them of the wire fraud advisory, even when you open escrow, send it to them. I want you to see this again, because these wire fraud people are very tricky. Okay, section 1 is the representation period and the right to represent. Now, in most of your contract forms, it gives a time period. Like, what is today, March 27th through September 27th is what most people will put on maybe a listing agreement or the older DRE. This form actually gives the period of representation where you insert buyer at the beginning. So Joe Buyer grants Keller Williams Realty San Diego Metro or San Diego Signature, the broker. It's not me, but it's the name of the company. Beginning on, so you put in the beginning date, and then you'll see where it says in the green, it says ending days later at 11:59 p.m. Or upon completion of a resulting transaction, whichever occurs first. Okay, so why did they do it this way? Well, they kind of did it to make it easier and more palatable for a buyer to want to sign this. The whole reason why they redid this was to make it easier for you to get a BRBC signed with your principal, so you have certain protections.
it might be that, they may be wondering why there's these little icons on there with the ghost. And the concept is what Robert's talking about right now. This form was redesigned to make it more friendly and not scary. And so they decided to use a friendly little ghost in these places where they've made it more friendly. And you're talking to a buyer, they may not want to sign a buyer representation agreement for 6 months or for a year. So you can say, well, okay, let's do what works for you. Let's do 30 days and see how it goes. That reassures them, and that makes it easier for you to use the buyer representation agreement.
And we'll get into the broker involved properties that shows how you'll be guaranteed. So like Mark said, you could do 30, you could do 7 days, you could do 14 days. But if you're going to do 6 months, and you got to put in 180 days, and that's what makes a buyer look like, whoa, 180 days? I don't want to be tied to you that long. So it's again to make it easier for you guys. Section 2, no pre-existing buyer representation agreement. This basically is that the buyer acknowledges they're not in an existing buyer-broker relationship with another broker, except identified paragraph 3, where you'll identify the other brokers and properties that buyer could potentially owe money to. And you should ask every buyer you come across as well too, did you ever sign anything with another broker?
Right.
And
That's
nine times out of 10, hold on, Mark.
I'm sorry.
9 times out of 10, they don't know. And they didn't know if they signed anything, because sometimes an agent won't even tell them they're signing it when they slip in a purchase agreement on DocuSign. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a great question to ask people that you start working with. Have you worked with another agent in your search for a home? And if so, why did you leave them? And by the way, did they have you sign any type of a form that looks similar to this, where they were representing you as a buyer? Or did they give you a list of properties that you viewed together before you decided to not work together any longer? Those are all really poignant questions to ask, because it leads to whether this section 2 and 3 need to be completed. So that, the buyer is not obligated to pay 2 brokers for, the same property that they acquire.
Here's my recommendation when it happens. So when I get the phone call from you guys as an agent stating I have a buyer, they don't know if they signed anything, but they know they signed something, I would go tell that buyer to go back and ask that agent give me copies of everything you signed. They should have it. Because if they DocuSign something, they automatically get an email copy of it. But if they're afraid to go back and ask that broker, then that's going to be a challenge because that broker might have a BRBC where they could be technically have to pay that broker as well too. So you're trying to protect them in that regards.
And unless they wet sign the document with a pen and ink, they probably have an email in their somewhere in their email account that has the document attached to it.
And then if they think they have something, then I would tell them to go back to the other agent and say, okay, great, I want not the TVA mark, what's the new form?
Termination of not the COBR. COBR.
Yeah, cancellation of buyer representation. Ask if they can get a copy of that because that'll protect them the buyer having to pay 2 commissions. Section 3 defines the property. You could be narrow, but it might not protect you, and you could be broad, and you could end up problematic. So 3A gives you a location. It even gives cities, it gives counties and price ranges. Or Section B is the following specified properties only, or C, the properties identified on the attached list.
So what would too narrow and too broad be?
So here's what happens with some of you agents that you might have a military buyer on a VA qualified, and they go out and start looking for homes. And this happens a lot with my VA agents. They realize, oh, I'm priced out of San Diego. I can't afford it here. So they truck them up to Riverside County, Temecula, Menifee, that area, because they can get a house up there for less money. So location or city or counties, you got to look at what client you have. If I had a VA client, I would check the box county, and I would put San Diego, Riverside, maybe Orange County. Orange County is a little bit more expensive. I don't know if I put that, but I'm just playing the scenario of what type of client you have.
And in price range, what would you suggest we do there?
Well, I would look at what they're pre-approved for, and I would do a range, because if you know they're pre-approval and you've spoken with their lender and you know that they can't go above a certain amount, I would put in a range of maybe $200,000, just maybe a little bit more going on the lower side, because maybe you'll get out there and they realize, oh, maybe I'll buy a condo instead of a house. So,
and if they've got, a really wide range of options like that they've told you that they're willing to do, maybe to be determined is best to put in the price range rather than trying to put it in a specific range above and below their pre-qualification amount.
I like the to be determined, because if you were that lotto winner in California that went to $2 billion, have you seen that he's on a buying spree? Bought a $25 million house, and he bought another $3 million house. So if you don't have it defined, all of a sudden you got a client that wins the lottery. They might be in a higher price range. They might not be. Just saying. Any questions on that section? Next section, section 4, identifies the compensation that will be paid to you, the agent or the brokers, for the services that are going to be given. So 4A, you can either put, well, my recommendation is to put 3% of the acquisition purchase price, or you can put a dollar amount, or you can put pursuant to the compensation schedule attached. And that's another, and Mark, you and I haven't talked about this, but that's another addendum that we've developed. And I think with this new one, we might not need it.
Yeah, with this new form, we've had a form, an addendum to the prior buyer representation agreement that addressed some issues that were not addressed in that earlier version. And so since this revised form has come out, we've kind of discontinued using that addendum, but you could structure some kind of a compensation schedule with a particular client. Maybe they are looking for multiple properties, and maybe that would affect the compensation they're willing to pay. Perhaps it's an investor buyer, and they say, I want you to find me homes in this price range, and this price range. And you could structure that on an addendum and incorporate that into this buyer representation agreement.
Let me run back up here. You just brought something up to me when you identify the property to be acquired. This has happened in the past where an agent would come to me and say, I have a buyer and they either want to buy in Carlsbad or Chula Vista. They don't know where. And in Carlsbad, they have an agent they're working with, but down in Chula Vista, they want me to help them with. So in that particular example, you could then describe that geographic area so that if they end up buying in Carlsbad, you won't be participating in that sale, the other agent will. So that has happened a few times. Okay, section 4B, broker right to compensation. This identifies how the broker will be entitled to the compensation, and it's basically called broker involvement. And this great thing about the updated BRBC, it defaults to non-exclusive compared to the original BRE where it was exclusive. So for all
Again,
you
it's
timers, it's probably something new for you.
It's more friendly. That's, again, another one of the little ghost icons there. It's not exclusive so that the buyer doesn't feel constrained or unwilling to enter into the agreement with you. Hey, this is a non-exclusive agreement. You're only going to pay me if I help you find a property that we work on together.
But here's what broker involvement means. The buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. The broker showed the property to the buyer virtually, meaning you're probably at the property doing a FaceTime. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property, or the property was introduced to the buyer by broker or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending the buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer. Okay. So again, this is why it's so great for the buyer to sign a BRBC now, because it's defaulted to non-exclusive. And as Mark said, you'll get compensated for the properties that you show that buyer or introduce them to. And then they won't have to worry about, well, I don't want to be exclusive with you for 6 months. I don't know if we're going to get along. Well, wouldn't you agree, Mr. Buyer, that at least for the properties I work hard on to show you, I should be paid for? Yeah, I can agree to that. Great. That's what this section means for you right now. You're non-exclusive for all the other properties I don't show you. Only the ones I do show you. Or if you wanted to go to exclusive, you could check 4B2. And that would make it exclusive during the representation, even without broker involvement. Meaning, let's say you check that box and you have a three-week commitment. On the third week, they did something with another agent and opened up escrow with another property, and you weren't the one that wrote the offer, then they would be responsible for paying you after the representation period and within the safety zone period. Section 4C talks about how do you cancel this buyer representation agreement. Again, this is to be very friendly. You see the little ghost over there. Who cancels it? Either the buyer or the broker may cancel this agreement. So if you're out there with a buyer that says, I don't want to work with you anymore, great, let's cancel the agreement. But you're still going to get paid on the properties that you showed them, and because that's what the agreement stipulated. So you can either terminate them upon receipt of notice or a few days after receipt, meaning maybe they want to, not have it canceled until Saturday of this week. You can do it days in advance.
So C1 actually applies to whether it's non-exclusive, and that could be either party anytime can terminate it. If you had checked the box previously that was at section 2 for what was it, 4B2, you see there's a corresponding box there in C2 then that one, the parties don't have a right to cancel without giving each other notice for 30 days, if it's an exclusive agreement. But if it's a non-exclusive agreement, either party can cancel at any time just by giving the other party notice.
Thank you, Mark.
And then the list of broker involved properties, the buyer's agent has 5 calendar days after a buyer cancels to say, here's the properties that I showed you during the period of time that our agreement wasn't together or was in force or active. And so that's what we talked about again earlier about asking the buyer, did your agent that you were working with before give you a list of properties? This is what you would be doing, you know, if a buyer and you canceled on you, or you decided to cancel with a buyer. It can go both ways.
So on C2.
Is there a preference? I'm sorry.
Hold on one second. On
Is there a
C2,
preference?
hold on one second, you can ask your question. On C2, if you check box 4B2, 4B2 makes it exclusive, then you would check box C2.
Correct.
So it's neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to the expiration by mutual agreement. Okay, who had a question?
That was me, Bob. Is there a preference over 4B1 versus 4B2 when we're getting into an agreement with a buyer? Would it be preferable for us to do the non-exclusive versus the exclusive?
Well, the non-exclusive is the more friendly version, and the buyer would be more willing to, you know, agree to that because they know it's not exclusive. They have more, both parties, broker, buyer's agent, and buyer have more freedom to cancel or to change the agreement. So it's a little bit of an easier version if you go with 4B1, but you do still have the option to go with 4B2 if you want an exclusive agreement.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
So in the case that you cancel, or you guys have a mutual agreement to cancel a non-exclusive, they still do have to pay you for the properties that you showed them if they find interest in one of them, correct?
If that scenario happened where the buyer and the buyer's agent canceled the agreement, the buyer's agent would have to give the buyer notice of involved broker involved properties within 5 calendar days after that cancellation, or else the buyer's agent's out of luck.
And we're going to get to that list, that
Yeah.
form that Mark's talking about soon.
And if the buyer did purchase one of those properties after the agreement expired with another agent, or made a deal with the seller directly or something, you would still be eligible for compensation of that, if as long as you followed that procedure of delivering that list of properties to the buyer once they canceled on you.
Okay. Thank you.
Next section is the accounting for payments to brokers by others. So it's basically the credit for the cooperating broker commission. If anyone other than buyer compensates broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited toward the buyer's obligation to pay the compensation. So if you up here in 4A put 3%, down here, it basically says, we're going to credit you whatever the seller is going to pay, or the other broker is going to pay. So let's say it's 2.5%, which means you'd only be responsible for 0.5 point. And we'll discuss about that a little bit further too, but you might want to only be a 3% buyer's agent where you get paid a full 3% no matter who you're dealing with and no matter what the cooperating broker is paying in the transaction.
Hey, Robert, let's role play that real quickly. So I'm the buyer and I see, it's 3%. I agreed to 3% in that first section. But then in 3D, I know that you're going to have cooperating broker. They might pay you something. Are you going to get paid 3% and the 2.5% that I see in the MLS?
Great question. Great question, Mr. Buyer. No. What it means is if a cooperating broker is offering 3% to or 2.5% to a buyer's broker, And then our agreement is at 3%. I'm only going to be paid the 2.5% from the cooperating broker, and the other 0.5 point you'll figure out to pay through your closing costs.
Or this next section we're about to talk about, 3G3 could come into play there. Now, I'm not the buyer any longer. I'm just saying now 3G3 could be an option in that scenario that we just played out, where the buyer's agent might ask the seller to pay for the shortfall of 0.5% by completing the SPBB and checking the box in 3G3, which we're now going to talk about.
3G3.
I think you're going to get to that maybe on the next slide.
Okay, well, let's go back up into 2D2. D2 is if third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to the broker or credited to the buyer. So in other words, if the buyer broker is at 2.5%, but the cooperating broker is doing 3%, you can determine in advance whether or not you want to give that buyer broker a 0.5 point or you keep the rest. And then Mark, you discussed 3D3.
3G3, it's in the little section up above there that we're about to talk about. Seller can ask to pay RPA 3G3 and car form. So in a shortfall situation where your BRE says 3%, cooperating broker commission in the MLS is 2.5, the buyer's agent can ask the seller to pay the other 0.5%. And we'll get to that in a moment.
What Mark is pointing out, 3G3 is in the purchase agreement.
Correct.
So that's where so if you guys are confused, that's what he's talking about right now. Okay. And then what's the protection period? The protection period is broker shall be entitled to the compensation provided in paragraph 4A within blank calendar days after expiration of the representation period. In other words, you're in that exclusive and then they decide to buy a property after your relationship's over, but it's a property you showed them. And you put it on the list that you sent to them and they decide to go buy it. You can set 30, 60, 90 days as your protection period. Mark, are you reviewing these? Are you seeing certain timeframes that people are putting in there?
I'm not seeing too many buyer representation agreements come through. Just a couple of agents are using them pretty regularly. But this, for those of you that have done listings, this section E is similar to the protection period that you would put in a listing agreement for which a seller could not sell to a buyer that you had presented or shown their property to.
But even if you put, let's say you put 60 calendar days, you still have to deliver to the buyer a written notice of those properties.
That's the NBIP, that's correct. Mm-hmm.
And then broker will disclose expected compensation from third parties. So disclosure of anticipated payments, broker, prior to writing an offer or property, will disclose to buyer the amount of compensation that the broker expects to receive from that other cooperating broker by either giving that person a copy of the MLS printout that shows the CBC on it, or a separate document, which we'll get to, called the Anticipated Buyer Broker Compensation Disclosure, or Form ABCD. Broker will also independently or through escrow disclose the final compensation broker receives from anyone other than buyer, and buyer is responsible for payment of compensation if the third party does not pay as anticipated. So why is this language in there? It's because the whole thing about buyer brokers compensation, we have a lot of suits there. NARD has been sued by the Department of Justice for buyer brokers. We've got seller and buyer class action lawsuits out there. So what this is, the whole thing is about transparency, to show what you as a buyer agent will get compensated for the work that you do.
And it also plays into the code of ethics, as terms of, agents are supposed to be transparent with their clients and explain the compensation that they're receiving. So all of these things are reasons why these forms were redesigned to make these disclosures more transparent. And this form is one way that you can do that.
This section, besides reconfirming agency in number 5, rediscloses agency relationships and the dual agency, single agency. This section 6A, it's the broker obligations. This is all the things that I will do for you. This is your chance to know what I'm doing. So this basically is the job description. So this is the time where you can see on the right-hand side, they say, sell yourself. What are you going to be doing? Well, I'm going to help you locate the properties. I'm going to negotiate on your behalf for those properties with terms and conditions you want to come to agreement to. I'm going to help you order reports and inspections and schedule and attend meetings and appointments with professionals chosen by the buyer. Provide a buyer with a list of professionals or vendors who perform the services described in the attached buyer BIA. Provide a broker as a referral list for such a requested services, and upon request, assist the buyer with financing process by making referrals to lenders known to broker. Hopefully that's already happened in advance. And then broker at section B will conduct a reasonably and competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of 1 to 4 of that home, and then communicate and deliver to the buyer any disclosures, material information. So blah, blah, blah. That's basically your job description. So pick out some of those things and highlight. I read a lot more of it, but rephrase it. I'm going to help you with inspections. I'm going to help you get an inspector at the property. If the inspector says we need to get a secondary inspection, I'm going to help you arrange that. Show what you're being paid for is really it. Section 7 addresses what the obligations are for the buyer. It also addresses, you'll see item 7E, the buyer material issues. We'll get to that. But this basically tells the buyer, it says to the buyer, this is what the buyer's obligations are: to act in good faith. Make sure that they get personal and financial information to a lender as soon as possible. Hopefully that's been taken care of prior to entering escrow, that you have a buyer that's been fully pre-approved with underwriting. They need to have reasonable care and other professional assistance. They need to review the reports and inspection reports and read them. And then 7F is buyer agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold broker harmless for all claims, dispute, litigation, judgments, blah, 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 by incorrect information supplied by the buyer or from any material issues that buyer failed to disclose to in writing to broker. So 7E, buyer material issues. That basically is what's important to a buyer. So what could be important to a buyer? Well, they don't want to be close to a freeway, or they don't want to look at homes that have septic tanks.
Or I don't want to have overhead power lines over my head in my backyard. You know, these are issues that you have to talk to the buyer about. And there's a form, BMI, buyer material issues, that you can give them and have them complete for the things that are real deal breakers for them, so that that doesn't become a he said, she said thing down the road.
I don't want to be next to a cemetery.
With the little
Okay.
ghosts.
Huh?
With those little ghosts.
Yeah, exactly. All right, section 10. This is where other advisories or addenda and disclosures are incorporated into the agreement. It's already checked to have the BTA, the BIA, and the PRBS be in the documents. Not recommended to do the statewide buyer seller advisory because that's a 12-page document.
14.
14, no, it's expanded. Okay, great. You can get that signed at a later time. 11, if there's other terms, you would put in a section. 12, entire agreement that basically says, this is the only agreement that's out there. There's no other agreement. This supersedes any and all agreements that you think it's out there, but this is it for now. And then the buyer in section 12A discusses entity buyers. So Mark, you do that one because you're so good at this on entity buyers.
Okay, what's an entity buyer? An entity buyer is a trust or a corporation or an LLC or a limited partnership or a power of attorney. Those are all situations where a person is representing an entity, a thing, a corporation. Let's use that as an example. So the person that has authority to do that is called the entity representative. So in this section, if that's the scenario that, that you were working with a buyer that wasn't an entity representative, you would complete the checkbox in 3A that says entity buyers. And then in A1, one or more buyers is a trust, corporation, LLC, probate, estate, partnership, holding a power of attorney, or other entity. And you would name that entity there, ABC Trust. And then on section 5, if the entity is a trust or under probate, the following is the full name of the trust or the probate case number. So if it was a trust, the ABC Trust of January 15th, 1999, or U.S. probate court case number, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And then in the section B, the buyer would sign on the signature byline. The printed name of the buyer would be on that line. And then the checkbox for printed name of legally authorized signer would be checked, and that would be placed on that third line. That would be the correct way to complete this section if it was an entity buyer. If it's not an entity buyer, you don't check the box in A, and you just have the buyer complete line 1 and line 2 in section B. If there's 2 buyers, it'd be in each of the 2 sections there. Signature by, printed name of buyer, printed name of buyer.
So Mark brings up a point about if it's an entity buyer, only do you check A, but if it's just an individual, you check B. But here's what you need to learn. If you are helping a buyer find a property and you start writing offers, before you even write offers, you should ask in part of your buyer consultation, do you plan to hold this in the name of a real estate trust or an LLC or a corporation or an individual? Hopefully they've had, if they want to do an LLC, a corporation, or an LLC, that they already have that formed. They can't say that they're going to put it in an LLC if it's not been fully formed yet with the state of California. But it's going to save you a lot of energy and effort, and your TC a lot of energy effort if they don't decide midstream, oh yeah, we want to put it in a trust. Oh yeah, we want to hold it in an LLC. Because now what has to happen is now we got to go back and do the whole process where the person that's responsible for or has the authority to sign on behalf of the trust or the LLC or the corporation, we have got to get some documentation from them. So it's better to know that in advance and get the documentation necessary to show who has authority to sign on behalf of the trust. Please ask that question at the initial buyer consultation. And if they say, I don't know, I understand what you're talking about, then they're probably just going to put an individual name. Any questions on that? I know entity issues in both listings and buy sides is Mark's biggest headache, because agents midstream want to change stuff and add it. Not that the agents want to, but the principals do. And then the TCs have to do double signatures on everything. And then the broker signature, that's where you're signed at the bottom, and the address, the email, your license number. Okay, here's the forms that we talked about earlier, the ABCD. The top part is the disclosure. Part 1 is the disclosure that broker will be paid.
Robert, can I stop you for 1 second? And can you
Yes.
go scroll back up a little bit
Sure.
to the previous broker signature section? So it says real estate broker firm. That would be, Keller Williams, San Diego Metro, or Keller Williams signature, address, and so forth like that. And there's not a place here for the agent to sign in this section. But when you see a thing where it says, broker signature, you as the agent have the ability to sign that on behalf of the brokerage because you're representing the brokerage. So this section doesn't have that, but if it had a signature for the broker, you would be able to sign that as the agent.
Good point, Mark. In other words, what Mark is saying, you don't need to send it to me to have me sign it.
Right.
The only thing I need to sign is an authorization to exclude from the MLS. And
Commission instructions.
permission instructions, but there's one other, is there one other thing? Oh, the
Or,
cancellation of,
And a cooperating broker compensation agreement if it's changing the compensation.
and a cancellation of listing.
Yeah.
So in this anticipated broker compensation disclosure, the top box again, disclosure that the broker will be paid, and the seller takes into account whether paying directly or indirectly. So you'll fill in the top section, the buyer's broker, the buyer, compensation to be paid pursuant to the MLS. So this is the disclosure you'll give to the buyer when you actually are starting to write properties. If you've got a BRBC in place, because the buyer's going to need to know, if you're not going to give them the MLS printout, you're going to give them this form, and you're going to have them initial at the property address when you first shown it, in the compensation offered by the cooperating broker. And that takes for 6 properties. And if you're showing them 20, you're going to have to get 4 more forms. And
I
then
can see
disclose
the-
all those 20 properties.
I could see how this could be used like just in the course of representing a buyer. Well, okay, this weekend we're going to go out and we're going to look at 2 properties. So you fill out this form and then you write in on the first 2 sections, the first 2 properties, and you can, attach an MLS printout or have the buyer initial an MLS printout that shows what the cooperating broker commission is, and check the box in the 4th column there that says MLS. And then next weekend, you go to see 2 more properties. Well, you use the same form and you fill out the next 2 sections and you do the same thing. Well, and once the form's filled up, you just put a, anticipated broker compensation disclosure 1 on it, and then you get another form and number it number 2, and, fill in the first 2 properties that you looked at that next day. So that's how that would, play out in actual use.
Can I ask, is this a mandatory form?
No. But it is, if you want to, in the sense that we want to do the transparency and the full disclosure and be able to evidence the list of the properties that you've shown a buyer, if you canceled the agreement and you wanted to deliver that notice of broker involved properties, this would be very helpful in putting that together. So
I can see agents just 99% of the time sending the MLS printout.
Yeah.
Because it's easier, The less forms you fill out, probably the happier you are. I just dropped all the forms that we're reviewing in the next few minutes in the chat box. So you'll see that ABCD was the last one I dropped in there. And then the final section is broker discloses final compensation on the last section. So that would be filled out once the property's in escrow, and you're going to disclose to the buyer exactly what the cooperating broker compensation is.
Robert, let me ask a question. Do you think that it would be adequate in terms of the transparency and disclosing the broker compensation that the buyer sees that on a preliminary closing statement or a final closing statement, which they have to sign and agree to? Would that be a sufficient disclosure of the buyer's compensation?
I don't know.
I'm wondering if that could be
Agent.
used, if that could be used in addition to or as an alternative to this form.
I would think it would be great to get an agent that's out there doing a lot of business to answer that question.
Mhm.
Because they're going to do what's the easiest way.
Yeah, I mean,
Especially if
that is one place that discloses to the buyer what the compensation that's being paid is.
And then the ABC, is this the second part of it? Just
So this is just breaking down. If you scroll back up again, you'll see that the form basically has like 3 sections, and these
Yeah.
next 3 slides are, zoomed in on those 3 sections.
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna breeze through this then.
So just the bullet points on the right in the blue box are really what you have to note about each of these sections.
Important, then the buyer needs to initial each property or be given the MLS statement, each property by address, expected compensation and MLS compensation field not confidential. Each MLS to decide whether to create a separate document that can be given to the buyer. I'm seeing in the chat box that Karine says she saw recently the buyer hot sheets now include the cooperating broker commission, whereas before it did not. And I am seeing in some MLSs, they are disclosing in the IDX feed, the buyer broker compensation.
And
So
those
that's-
are appearing like in Zillow and Redfin, those syndication feeds that come through IDX, right?
Yeah, that's where it shows up. Seller payment to buyer's broker. So this form basically is
This is the form that's being misused a lot right now
is
because
it?
yes, agents are thinking that this is a way to define compensation and not realizing that it requires that there is a buyer representation, a BRBC with the buyer in order to even use this form. So many agents are using it and confusing it with the cooperating broker compensation agreement. So this is only used, this SPBB is only used when you have a buyer representation agreement. And in the example I gave a little bit earlier, the compensation in the BRBC is 3%. The cooperating broker commission in the MLS is 2.5, and the buyer's agent has the option to ask the seller to pay that other 0.5% or that shortfall by filling out this SPBB form and sending it with the offer to the buyer. Now, is the seller obligated to agree to this? No. But if you ask for the additional compensation and the seller agrees, yeah, well, 3% is normal and the buyer is very strong. I don't disagree with that. I think I can go ahead and do it. Now, what the seller does with the listing agent in terms of the compensation that they've already worked out in the listing agreement, that's up to them. That has nothing to do with this. This is a buyer's agent request to the seller to pay for a shortfall in commission between what the buyer has with the buyer's agent in a buyer broker agreement and what's in the MLS. Does that make sense to everybody? Because a lot of people are very confused on this.
So Mark, where does this form go?
This form is sent with the offer, completed and sent with the offer, if the buyer's agent is asking for the seller to pay for that shortfall.
And if they check the
it is
box 3G3 that they're under. a
Correct.
buyer broker.
That is only valid if 3G3 is checked. And I think you'd have to give a copy of the buyer representation agreement too, to prove what the compensation that's defined in the BRBC.
So number one is the BRBC compensation, what you defined in there. Number two is what is the broker's compensation they're applying? And then section 3 is what's the difference? And seller only pays the difference between 1 and 2.
Right. And it's not a double dip situation where there's some confusion that thinks that, oh, you're going to get paid 3% from the BRBC and the 2.5% from the MLS. No, it's a credit towards the amount defined in the BRBC and a request to pay the shortfall, which is optional for the seller to agree to it or not agree to it.
I have a question. So say I'm representing the seller and I'm presenting offers at that point when you're the seller's agent, is it, because it's not something I've paid attention to in the past, is it something that we should be aware of to say, okay, watch out for how do we know that the buyers or potential buyers that have submitted offers, their agent requested a 3% commission, whereas the listing, we only advertise it as a 2.5%,
right?
The buyer's agent. So
go ahead and finish your
yeah,
question.
so my question is like, how do I not miss that Cause say they're, you know, offers one of the ones that my seller wants to highly consider to accept.
Right. Well, there are those pluses and minuses to doing this, you know, from the buyer's agent and buyer's perspective. They could be received, that offer could be received by the seller. And if they don't understand how this works, they could say, well, I don't even really think we should respond to that offer. So there's that
Mhm.
possibility in a risk, let's call it, in tendering an offer that has this with it. However, if it's, you know, like your buyer's very strong and maybe they're offering above asking, or maybe they are all cash or something like that, that makes their offer more desirable, and the seller hasn't received any other offers that are as desirable as that one, well, then the seller might look at it and say, well, that's a really good offer and it's for a good price. I guess I'd be willing to pay that extra 0.5%. But then you said that you were actually the listing agent evaluating these offers with the seller. So you'd have to decide between you and the seller if the seller wants to accept that offer, and your listing agreement is for 5%, 2.5, 2.5. Are you going to give up the other 0.5% to pay to the cooperating buyer's broker, or are you going to ask the seller to kick in another 0.5%?
Yeah.
And
And
then
my
the-
other question, sorry,
One more point on
Okay.
this. When you're a listing agent reviewing these offers with the seller, you have to make sure that all the criteria are met. Like, in other words, that the buyer's agent has given you the buyer representation agreement, correctly filled out the SPBB, and checked the box in 3G3, because otherwise it's invalid.
okay.
Okay, did you have one more question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, as a safeguard, should we consider adding verbiage in a counter and make it kind of like a habit to counter all these, to say, you know, buyers compensation not to exceed 2.5%, or buyer's
Well-
broker compensation, or
In the listing agreement?
well, in the offers, so say we're accepted,
Oh,
you know, we're looking at offers and we want to counter the top 3.
oh, you want to do one counter offer for all? Okay.
Yeah, like a multiple counter offer. Would
Well, I would
that
think
be-
that you would, to state as a clause in the seller of multiple counter offer, RPA 3G3 does not apply, or seller does not agree with RPA 3G3, if that's what the seller wants to do.
Okay,
So
Absolutely.
let's dumb this down. Mark, this is the purchase agreement I have up here.
Yeah,
When would an agent check this box 3G3 in the purchase agreement?
right.
That was a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, repeat it because I didn't understand.
When would an agent, a buyer's agent, check this box 3G3 on the purchase
Okay.
agreement?
Hypothetical scenario, you have a buyer representation agreement with a buyer that says they're going to pay you 3%. The cooperating broker compensation in the MLS is 2.5%. You talk to your buyer and say, hey, I have the ability to ask the seller to pay that difference between 2.5% and 3% that you and I agreed to, by checking this and sending them this form. Are you okay with that? Buyer probably say, yeah, because if the seller pays, the buyer doesn't have to pay. So they'll probably say, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. So the buyer's agent checks 3G3, that box, seller agrees to pay the obligation to buyer, and then prepares the SPBB form and sends that with the offer along, and I would suggest along with the buyer representation agreement, so that it validates the difference between the compensation in the buyer representation agreement and what's in the MLS.
Okay, I'm gonna dumb it down even further.
Okay,
You check this box if you're writing a purchase agreement, if you have a buyer BRBS.
correct. Got that prerequisite, have to have a BRBC.
If you don't have a BRBC, you don't check this box.
You cannot check it. It's not applicable unless you have a buyer.
But you're seeing people checking it, thinking that when this first came out, not our agents, but other agents are checking it, thinking, oh, I got to make sure I get paid.
Correct. they're mistaking it, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, they're mistaking this SPBB for an equivalent to the cooperating broker compensation agreement, where you would define or clarify, confirm the compensation that's being offered in the MLS. That's not what it's for. Those are two different scenarios.
So back to when you check the box, because you have a BRBC that defines that you get 3%,
Right?
let's say, you would submit this form, the SPBB,
Correct.
and you would check box 3 because you're asking the seller to pay that additional 0.5 point.
Correct.
Everybody got that?
But the seller does not have to agree to that. It's not automatic. It's just a request like any other request, a
Yeah.
negotiable item.
Exactly. Hopefully that's not too confusing, but I know it is. There's a lot there to grasp and understand.
Everyone, if you get into this situation, you're not sure, just call Robert or I or text us or whatever, and we'll happily walk you through it again.
Yeah. Next form, cancellation of buyer representation. This is where we're going to cancel cancel the buyer representation forms where they're exclusive, non-exclusive, and define who's canceling and the protection period for how long you can be paid on something if the buyer goes around and buys something that you showed them. In section 2, section 1, again, the parties, who's the broker, who's the buyer. Section 2 defines who can cancel, either buyer, broker, or both. 2A is you check which one you're going to, who's canceling, the buyer or the broker. And then B is the effective date of the cancellation. And then C, the notice applies to all properties that may be subject to the buyer representation, or only for the following properties. So if you just want to define a few properties, you can. Broker will not be the buyer's agent during any negotiation or transaction that results between buyer and seller regarding any property. Any questions the buyer has about the property shall be directed to the seller's broker, if any. And then E defines the commission, the compensation due to broker. Section F is it a unilateral or a broker cancellation, or is it a buyer and or broker mutual cancellation? Depending on the scenario. And then this section addresses maybe some, what's the top part, Mark? 3A?
3A.
Yeah.
Only applies if paragraph 2E2 is checked above and both parties sign below. So could you scroll up to 2E2, please? Oh, I think you went too far.
It's in the BRBS though. The
No,
BRBC.
I think it's in. Oh, you're right. Yeah, 2E. Okay. Oop.
2B2.
That's 4.
Yeah. So you guys were learning these forms as much. And even if you called us, asked to walk through, we'd have to walk through it and figure it out at the same time. We're not going to know all the answers. I'm not seeing it, Mark.
I think it's right there. Just go up one page.
2E2.
Yeah, go up one page. So
Okay.
it's right there. 2E2.
Okay.
Compensation will be paid as specified in paragraph 3 below, and only if both parties agree by signing paragraph 3. Okay, so let's look at paragraph 3. Go down. Okay. Subsequent acquisition of property during the buyer representation period, for which there was a broker involved prior to cancellation. So this, I believe, is where the the NBIP form comes in, notice of broker involved properties, which is, you see a little bit about on the next page there. So the cancellation occurs, and then you would complete 3A, and if there's a protection period, deliver the notice of broker involved properties. And I guess I'm a little unclear on what 3A is exactly for, but it's related to that cancellation and notice with the following form, the NBIP form.
We'll ask it on the statewide broker call. Or it also, item B is expenses incurred. Perhaps the buyer can pay the broker certain out-of-pocket expenses. Maybe the agent paid for the person to fly into town, so airplane fare.
Yeah, there could be some expenses like that that a broker, I mean, a buyer's agent might have forwarded. It's a little bit of an unusual circumstance, but that would be what 3B would be for.
And then or broker receives a referral fee. Maybe if they don't want to work with you, you can refer them to another agent that they want to work with to write the offer. That's a good way to go.
Yeah, or that could play out like if they, decided, well, we decided we're going to move to Nevada instead of buying locally here, then you could refer them to an agent in another state.
Where it would happen here, because I get a lot of these calls, is if a buyer says, I want to get out of this buyer broker agreement because I want this other agent to help me. And you agree to let them go if that other agent gives you a referral fee. That's the easiest way to take care of things. You're not going to get the full amount, but it's just the easiest. I'm telling you what I deal with all day long, and I think it's the easiest, is sometimes better. D is broker to receive compensation from seller. Perhaps the seller is going to pay the brokerage. Or E, no compensation. You don't owe me any compensation. Getting rid of you. And then this is the form Mark was talking about, the notice of broker involved properties. So what this applies to is the protection period after purchase, after expiration. This list must be given at time of expiration, and that list can be given 5 days after a unilateral, meaning both people, one person decided to cancel. One person decided to cancel. And then it's a reminder to that buyer to notify the new broker that they're going to do business with, and then a place for date and signature. So the top part basically just outlines the guarantee for payment, even after the expiration period, as long as you send in that list of notice of broker involved properties, which is this. You can see where it's highlighted here. Pursuant to the representation agreement, broker identifies the following property for which there was broker involvement, and then more than likely you'll put see attached list if it's more than 3 or 4.
So here's the scenario. You have a non-exclusive agreement, and all of a sudden you get an email from the buyer that says they want to cancel. So, and they can cancel unilaterally for whatever reason they want to. So could you as the broker. But you have to then prepare that form, notice of broker involved properties, and the cancellation. And you have to deliver this notice of broker involved properties in that unilateral cancellation, non-exclusive situation within 5 days after you've received that notice that the buyer wanted to cancel. If it's an exclusive representation, then the parties have to give one another 30 days, and that notice of broker involved properties can be transmitted within that 30-day period of time.
Any questions on that? And then the buyer transactional advisory. So what is an advisory? So advisory is basically informational purposes delivered to a buyer. What does it do? It says, we're advising you about this. But what does it do for the broker? It kind of protects us because we need to advise them on certain stuff. So this is where we get sued. If you've been in risk management meetings, you see on every risk management, I say, what's the number one thing that an agent, a buyer says to me or says to me when they want to sue us? It's like, your agent never told me that. That's what these advisories are for. They're not just a form you give them and say, here's an advisory. You kind of go through in some of the forms and talk about, or let them know you need to read this form because you're buying a house and these are some of the transactional items that we need you to know about.
So this kind of like in the buyer inspection advisory, which is attached to the purchase agreement, it tells the buyer what they should be doing and watching out for. Same thing here, buyer transactional advisory, what they should be aware of and what their responsibilities are, what the agent's responsibilities are, and so forth. So it's just an advisory.
And you'll see in the blue box, it outlines the buyer's responsibilities, what the agent will do or not do, and reminder about dual agency. Okay, questions. This is the time where we take questions from the audience.
That was intense, right? Everyone's like,
I'm exhausted.
hey, well, if you're seeing this for the first time, don't feel bad. Robert and I have gone through it about 4 or 5 times, and we're still have questions that we're not 100% clear on. So don't feel bad if you haven't grasped everything about it in this education.
What's the most common mistake we make as agents when completing this form?
It's not so much in completing the BRBC, it's that the what is the buyer, the 3G3 form, buyer, I can't even remember the name, the acronym now. That gets sent, or the buyer's request for compensation. Which one is it, Robert? Do you remember?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to look for the documents to put in the chat box.
I have it right here. The SPBB, seller's payment for buyer's broker, that gets completed and sent with an offer when there's no buyer representation agreement.
Okay.
Again, there's 2 forms that are going to address, compensation for an agent. The CBC, cooperating broker compensation agreement, that you could use if a property is in the MLS to confirm the compensation or to confirm an agreement to change the compensation of what was offered in the MLS, or to define compensation for a property that's not in the MLS. So the CBC, you could use that, really, you could use it on any transaction to confirm what was listed in the MLS. So here's the scenario. You find the listing, you send, you go to see it with the buyer, you look at your printout that you took out and it says 2.5%. And then all of a sudden you look at the MLS again and it says 2%. And you're like, wait a second, I thought it was 2.5. And I have a printout here that shows that it was 2.5 at one point in time. So that's where I'm saying you could use that cooperating broker compensation agreement anytime to confirm the compensation. But that is what that form is for. CBC is to confirm the compensation, to change the compensation, or to, for a property that's not in the MLS, to define the compensation. This SPBB is only used when you have a BRBC and there's a shortfall between that amount of compensation the buyer and buyer's agent have agreed to and what's in the MLS. So that's the most common misuse of it.
So I uploaded the entire presentation in the chat box, so you can have that and look at it. I also uploaded 2 quick guides. One of it is the one that's pulled up on my screen. It's the buyer representation misconception corrections. I highly recommend you download that and read it. That will help make sense of this if you can see it in print. I'm of the adage that you might hear it from us here, but most people are not auditory learners. They're more visual. They need to see stuff, which is why I tend to do presentations where we show you examples. And some of you are kinesthetic, where you have to learn by doing. So I highly recommend pulling up the BRBC and filling it out and testing it, rather than just waiting until the time comes that you need it and not knowing what to do. And then you call me or Mark freaked out. Remember, an emergency on your part is not an emergency on ours if you didn't take the time in advance to learn. We're here to help you, but not when it's like, okay, you had the opportunity to learn. And we'll teach you, but don't think we're going to jump right away because you're in a rush. And we do have some agents that are that way, unfortunately, so I have to make a clarification on that. Nobody here, just usually our high D people.
Thanks, everybody, for attending today. We really appreciate it.
All right, everybody have a great day.
Thank you.